So, should we take the opinion of philosophers of religion more importantly than we take the opinions of other kinds of philosophers, specifically when we're talking about the existence of God? So, philosophy of religion is the subdiscipline of philosophy that specifically focuses on the nature and the existence of God. Philosophers of religion will talk about arguments for theism, arguments against theism. They'll talk about specific kinds of theism, like classical theism. You'll have arguments for and against divine simplicity, or like classical theism. You have arguments for or against neoclassical theism, so like theistic personalism. And you'll have discussions around the problem of evil, the ontology of God, although that can get into more metaphysics. But philosophy of religion is very much just focused on the idea of God. Can we discern God's existence through the natural world, which is more natural theology, which is a specific, I guess, a specific subdiscipline of philosophy of religion. But that's what philosophy of religion is doing. People who publish in philosophy of religion journals mainly focus on arguments for theism and arguments against theism. So should we take the opinions of philosophers of religion more authoritatively, or should we have a higher credence for what they're saying compared to what other philosophers are saying? So according to the 2020 Philosophers survey, only about 18% of philosophers actually believe in God. It's very, very low. And you have roughly 60 to 65% are atheists, and around 10 to 15% are agnostic. On the other hand, if you go to philosophy of religion, it's the exact opposite. Roughly 67, 66%, I believe, of philosophers of religion are theists, whereas only around 20% are atheists, and then you get around 13%-ish are going to be agnostics, or others / don't know. This is according to the 2020 Philosophers survey, a subdiscipline of philosophy that I know of in which the majority of philosophers actually accept theism, or are leaning towards theism at the very least. And this is very surprising because it's the only subdiscipline of philosophy that actually talks about God's existence. And so I've heard people try to argue both sides. Some people should have made claims as strong as, because philosophers of religion are the only kinds of philosophers who are actually dealing with issues in the philosophy of religion, they are the only people who are qualified to talk about God's existence, right? If we're trying to make an appeal to expertise, we shouldn't appeal to all philosophers. We should appeal specifically to philosophers of religion. I've heard other people argue that, no, we need to take into account bias, right? Because there's a kind of bias called selection bias, in which people will select particular fields that are more of interest to them, or maybe they're biased towards particular conclusions within that field. And so the reason that a lot of people become philosophers of religion is because they're Christian theists who are trying to prove Christianity, right? And that's not a controversial claim. The majority of philosophers of religion come into philosophy of religion as theists, as Christian theists. Most of them leave as Christian theists. Most of the ones who come in as atheists leave as atheists, right? Most people don't do any kind of converting, so their assumption has, or their conclusion has already been assumed when they start, and it rarely ever changes. I can think of a couple of instances of people changing from atheist to theist, or theist to atheist, or maybe becoming an agnostic or leaving agnosticism. I can think of Peter Van Inwagen, who was an agnostic and he became a theist. I can think of William Rowe, who was a theist, a Christian theist, and he became an atheist. I can think of maybe Josh Rasmussen is a good example. He, to my understanding, was an atheist, agnostic, probably more of an agnostic, who eventually became a theist. Outside of that, it's very, very rare that you'll actually get someone to change their position on a particular issue in the philosophy of religion, right? And so some people will say, well, actually, philosophers of religion are just biased because they're all Christian theists. So they're already going to be predisposed to accept theism, and so we really shouldn't consider their opinion any more valuable than any other kind of philosopher. Now, I want to take a kind of middle position and say that the opinion of philosophers of religion is going to carry a little bit more weight than the opinion of a philosopher of science on God's existence. And I think if we're going to have any kind of respect for the discipline, we need to say that. Because there is value that comes from engaging in discussions in philosophy of religion, publishing in journals, going to conferences, and going on YouTube and getting interviewed and whatnot, right? Like Graham Oppy has like 1 million interviews on YouTube. That guy, he goes on everyone's YouTube channel. So like there's value in actually engaging in the discussions, and there needs to be more weight given to philosophers of religion. But nevertheless, I don't think that we should delegitimize or dismiss the opinions of other people. So I don't think you have to be a philosopher of religion to have a valid opinion on God's existence. I think other philosophers are perfectly within their right to accept or reject theism based on non-philosophical grounds or on philosophical grounds that are not specifically philosophy of religion related. So someone may be a philosopher of mind, right? And they may accept identity theory, or let's say they accept type A physicalism, right? If you're a type A physicalist, the idea of a God existing is just pretty much not even possible given your worldview. So you may be a philosopher of mind who's never studied the arguments for theism or for atheism, but you are a type A physicalist, you're an a priori physicalist, you think that there is not even an epistemic gap between the physical and the mental, and so you're a naturalist. It's going to follow from that, and so you're not going to even accept theism. And it's on philosophical grounds, but it's not on philosophy of religion grounds. It's specifically on the philosophy of mind, and an implication of your view within the philosophy of mind is that you have to reject theism. And so I think we can say people are rational in accepting or rejecting theism while not studying philosophy of religion or not having a PhD in philosophy of religion. I don't have a PhD in philosophy of religion. I've only been studying it for like 2 years, and I've only scratched the surface of what there is to know, right? But nevertheless, I still think that the opinions of philosophers of religion should carry more weight than the opinion of the average person and the opinion of a philosopher who doesn't specialize in philosophy of religion. The example that I've always heard of is, would you trust a organic chemist to explain quantum mechanics to you? Probably not. Would you ask a quantum physicist to explain evolutionary biology to you? Probably not. They're both all three of these people are scientists, right? The chemist, the biologist, the physicist are all scientists, but they have different specializations, right? They all are focusing on different areas. And I think the same thing is generally true of philosophy, that you may have a philosopher of science and a philosopher of religion, and a philosopher of logic, an epistemologist, a philosopher of mind, whatever, right? And they're all philosophers, but they're specializing in slightly different things. They have expertise in slightly different areas, and so we should give higher levels of credence to the philosophers that are talking about something that they specialize in. And so I think even if the majority of philosophers of religion are Christian theists who come into the discipline as Christian theists and maintain Christian theism throughout that entire process, I do think that most of them are relatively unbiased. I see bias every once in a while. I see a lot of, I think William Lane Craig's very biased, for example, but nevertheless, I think we should still hold their opinions to a relatively higher extent than that of what we hold to others. Now, I don't want to be making an appeal to authority. I'm not saying because they have the PhD and they are theists, therefore we should be theists. But I'm saying it's certainly something that we should take into account when we're thinking about the probability of God's existence, that there's a lot of really smart people who have spent decades studying issues in contemporary philosophy of religion and are theists. It's something to to note, and it certainly should at the very least make us think that there is at least a kind of a priori plausibility to theism, even if we can't get all the way to therefore theism is correct or therefore theism is probable. We should think theism probably isn't too improbable. It's probably not like incredibly unlikely. It's at least somewhat likely, given that fact. Although there may be a lot of other pieces of evidence that should make us think that theism is improbable. But I do think that there is something in the sentiment that we should be giving them a little bit more weight, giving the opinions of philosophers of religion a little bit more weight. Now, we should primarily be evaluating them based on their arguments, but nevertheless, I still think that there's just a kind of ethos, there's a kind of inherited credibility that I get when I listen to someone who has a PhD in what I'm learning, right? Like, I'm not really very interested in hearing just like a scientist talk about philosophy. I've heard Neil deGrasse Tyson talk way too much about philosophy of religion. It gives me a headache every time I have to hear this guy talk about metaphysics or philosophy of religion. I can't do that shit. I mean, that guy pisses me off, bro. Okay, that's a different question though. But I want to know that the person who I'm actually listening to has some credentials or has some background in the thing they're talking about. And so I think we should see them as having slightly more credibility, but not purely basing it off their credentials or whatever their beliefs are. We should still mainly evaluate it based on their arguments. But yeah, that would be my video for today, and just some thoughts.